Have health insurance? Pardon me.
Yeah, I do. Yeah,
That's helpful. Yes. Well, good to see everyone. We'll go ahead and dive in. If others join us, they can get on here. Just wanted to know if anybody has any general questions. General questions about the Old Testament that we can cover this year, or anything specific about this week's particular readings that I can make sure to try to address.
Yes, I have a question, Jim. Just reading. Do you hear me?
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yeah.
Yeah, just from the history part of this, the continuous wars, first Egypt and then a succession of people, and finally we come to David, and it seems that was David the only one in that history, and is that the beginning? I mean, the promised land was, if we go back in history 3,000 years, it was promised apparently Egypt's. But then eventually, somehow, the Jewish people decided it was their promised land. And I in particular, I wondered about the aggressors in all of these wars and what their cause was. It was David against the Philistines, apparently. But what was the cause of the war? Was it just who's ever stronger can get it?
Okay, those are good questions. Well, that'll certainly be a meta theme that will be part of things as we go through, John, because there are going to be a lot of conflicts over this little piece of land. Part of it's internal, part of it's external. Part of it is typical human stuff. We want to defend our turf and stake out our territory, and others come in and want it. The Jews came in at one point. The Philistines were invaders also. Then you had the big boys, Egypt, Assyria, Babylon, Persia, Greece, Rome, that wanted it too. And so that's going to certainly be an overarching theme. So thanks for naming that, and we'll be attentive to that. Go ahead, Becky.
Yeah, just a curious question along those lines, and I'm sure it will be answered as we go along. What, in my mind, and perhaps I'm totally wrong, was the general quest of these wars just to grab land, to claim a territory by, I imagine in my mind that it's like some of the African tribes, the warrior tribes, just fighting each other over land, or just because they fight. Mm-hmm. So was it over land principally?
Principally, yes. As it is today. I mean, we've had wars in Israel well into the 20th century for those same reasons. So it's nothing new.
Kind of even now.
Yep.
Yeah. Okay. Thank you.
Any other general? Yeah, Regina.
I am so excited about this. I'm not sure how we're going to manage to cover all of it in this year, but I am so excited that you're doing this for us. I appreciate it. The one thing that kind of came up as I was reading, they referred to the J source. Are you going to kind of hit on some of these?
We'll talk about J source next week. I'm not of the opinion that J, E, P, and D are all that hugely important, but we will talk about J, E, P, and D next Sunday. So that will be part of it.
Okay, good. Okay, thank you.
It's mentioned in chapter 2 in a fair amount of detail, and then we'll go through it some next week. But I also want to get into that first creation story next week as well. So.
Okay, thanks.
Good question. Any others? Okay, well, we're taking things out of order, as you well know, starting with the appendix and with chapter 4 today. Jimmy is holding up his third edition book. I have the first edition book, and the third edition book actually has the chapters in exactly the order that I'm choosing to do things. So apparently, the professor got some feedback and decided to change things around. So Jimmy actually will be able to start at page 1 and go straight through with the third edition. But I wanted to start with the appendix today, briefly. And let me throw my screen up there. There it goes. So you all should be able to see the slide now.
Yes.
Everybody's got it. Okay. So this is similar to the chart in your book. It's from a different book. It's on page 4 instead of page 500, whatever. But it shows the different books of the Old Testament in Protestant, Orthodox, and Roman Catholic columns, Protestant column, and then the Hebrew Bible column. And really the only place they line up is easily is in the first 5 books of the Bible. After that, they start to diverge as you look through all the Bibles. The chart in your book is on page 546 in this book, which is similar. I chose this one just because it has all the Jewish names as well. So if you notice, we talked about this summer with the Jewish Hebrew Bible and what you call that and all that mess, Old Testament or Hebrew Bible or something else. They have 3 basic divisions: the Torah, the Nevi'im, which is the prophets, and they have former prophets and latter prophets. And then they have the Ketuvim, which is the writings, and that's the rest of the books. And so their order goes very differently from ours. We start out with the first 5 books: Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. But then we get a little bit of divergence. They go Joshua, Judges, Samuel, and Kings, which are 1 book each. We split them into 2 books. We add Ruth in because of where she goes chronologically. We throw Chronicles in, Ezra, Nehemiah, and those appear much later in the Jewish Bible. So they've got their agenda for the way they arrange things, and we've got a different agenda. One of the reasons that Christian Bibles end up with Malachi is because Malachi points ahead to the coming of the Messiah and the forerunner. One of the last things mentioned in Malachi is that before the Messiah comes, there'll be a forerunner coming. And then we turn the page in our Bibles and we've got the New Testament, and John the Baptist shows up in the wilderness. So to us, that's a logical way of arranging the books. For the Jews, it's a different thing. So we will look at basically Protestant books, and we'll also be looking at some of these apocryphal books that are in the Roman Catholic and Orthodox Bibles. They are Jewish writings that didn't make the cut into the Jewish Bible. The Jewish canon was not locked in until after Christianity started. So the church started using some of these books like the Maccabees and Baruch, Tobit, Judith, Wisdom of Solomon, Ecclesiasticus, not Ecclesiastes, but Ecclesiasticus. So the church kept some of these. At the Reformation, the Protestants said, we're going to follow the Jewish Bible as far as what books are in and what books are out. And the Roman Catholics and Orthodox said, nope, we've been keeping these in our Bible, so we'll keep them in. So this year, we'll actually look at all what we would call the Protestant canon of the Bible, / Jewish canon of the Bible. But we'll also be referring some to these other books that we have in our section called the Apocrypha, or deuterocanonical, second canon writings. So we'll be looking at all those. One other thing I wanted to highlight, this is just a zoom in of that same slide. The Jewish names of the books are different. We call the book Genesis, which is a Greek word, Exodus, which is a Greek word. The Jews have different words: Bereshith, Shemoth, Vayikra, Bemidbar, Devarim. And usually it's either a summary of the theme of the book or the first word or first major word in the book that gives these books their names. Now the prophets are named for who they are. Yeshai-Ahu, Isaiah, Yirmeyahu, Jeremiah, Yehizkel, Ezekiel, and so on and so forth. But so they've got slightly different names. They're more Jewish than our names. So that was in the appendix. Any questions about that? We will be going through all these books as we go through the year here. Okay. Well, the next piece, chapter 4, really did talk a lot about some geography and some history of the Holy Land. And if you have not encountered that stuff before, chapter 4 may seem a little dense because there's a ton of information. One of the things they were talking about is what you call it. Today we call it the modern nation state of Israel. Israel at different times is not an accurate term for this land. If you remember, the kind of most generic term you can use that's the least loaded is the Levant. Levant. Scholars often will call this area the Levant. If you call it anything else, whether it's Palestine or Israel, Judea, those have other layers of meaning, and some of those are loaded terms, especially in the 21st century. So the Levant is probably the most generic term here. But the modern nation state of Israel, we need to be careful here because the Holy Land that we think of is not necessarily contiguous with these borders. They did trek all over the place here in what we would call Israel plus the neighboring countries. But oftentimes they'll be talking about going from Dan to Beersheba, which is kind of roughly this area here. And so it kind of ignores the Negev desert in the south as a separate region. So that's something we'll encounter as we go through things. Some of you may have seen a few of these slides before. We see Israel on the map like that, and it looks like a big, gigantic country. And we see it on the map like that, and it's kind of hard to get a sense of scale. So there is the nation state of Israel, and there is Texas to scale. So Israel is not a gigantic country. It's a couple or three counties in Texas in size, slivers of some counties. So it's not huge at all. You can drive north to south. I didn't drive all the way north to south, but you can drive north to south from north to middle at least in a couple hours. You can go east to west in less than an hour of driving time. So it's not a gigantic country geographically. So 60-ish miles, give or take, wide, 250 north to south. And yeah, I've shown these slides before, but this is always amazing to me. The difference in terrain, these are all pictures from Israel. You've got areas that look like New England a little bit up in the north, and you've got deep, deep desert, looks like Death Valley in the south, and lots of things in between, crammed into a tiny, tiny geographical area. There's some other pictures, just wide variety. In North America, you'd have to drive hundreds or thousands of miles to get the variety you might be able to get in 20 miles of driving in Israel. It can change very, very rapidly. It's a little disconcerting, actually, how quickly the terrain can change. There's some more.
Is the picture in the bottom, well, a minute ago, right corner, where it shows all those rocks and then the Mediterranean, I guess, is that the typical coastline of Israel?
That's actually not the Mediterranean. That's the Dead Sea. Coastline of Israel, the Dead Sea goes up against these mountains and cliffs and canyons. The coastal plain, the Mediterranean has a coastal plain. We'll look at that in a minute, Abby.
Okay, thank you.
You know, it looks much more like this. And you know, there are hills that are drier and hills that are wetter and hills that are completely barren depending on where you are. But we'll look at some of that. So here is Israel superimposed on a little bit bigger map of Texas here. And I've arranged this so that the latitude matches up. So one of the things I always mention is that Jerusalem and Odessa, downtown Odessa and downtown Jerusalem, are almost exactly the same latitude. And so on this scale, the very tippy top of Israel, you know, hits between Slayton and Post, north to south, and you almost go down to Del Rio for the southern tippy bottom point there. But the heavy population area is going to be the northern half of this, because there's a lot of desert down in this southern part, southern triangle, the Negev desert. All right, this was a map in the books, talking about the famous Fertile Crescent and talking about Mesopotamia. If you notice, there are a lot of names here. There are modern names like Egypt, Saudi Arabia, Iran, Iraq. They've also put ancient names in a different font: Assyria, the Hittite Empire. Egypt was also running around all this time. Ethiopia. Saudi Arabia is much later. They talked about Arabia, but not Saudi Arabia. That's a 20th century thing. So you've got this area of fertility in the midst of some pretty dry land here. So a lot of the action of the Bible is going to be really constrained to this area, mostly the Holy Land, but they're going to interact with their neighbors this way and up this way. These are the areas that are going to impinge upon the history of the Jewish people in this area in the center here. Why? Well, by satellite today, it's very clear. Now, these are modern satellite pictures. Agricultural patterns weren't identical back in the day, but this gives you some idea. Here's Israel here, what we would call Israel. Here is the Fertile Crescent. You can see greenery here following these rivers, and you can see greenery going down the Nile Valley and the Nile Delta and deep desert elsewhere. And so here's another satellite photo straight on. Again, Egypt and the Nile and the Delta. Other than those, in this little area where they've flooded in this low area to have an agricultural area. Other than that, Egypt is very, very deserty. The Sinai Peninsula is almost pure desert. If you notice in Israel, there is some agriculture. Syria and Jordan, you get some agriculture over this way. Lebanon going north. And then you get the Fertile Crescent. You've got the Euphrates River here, and it's kind of like the Nile. The Euphrates River is kind of a ribbon of green through the desert. Then the Tigris River goes up into the mountains. And so you get kind of a sense of some of the greenery that you can have in this area of Mesopotamia. But you really do have deep desert where no one can really live, or at least not many people. You can have a few Bedouins running around with a few sheep, but if you want to sustain a population, it's got to be in these areas here. All right, so far so good. Okay, one of the things I did want to highlight here that he doesn't do in the book so much, but he talks about this, but I wanted to take a slice of west versus east. Now, Abby was asking about the Mediterranean. The Mediterranean, and the scale is exaggerated, the heights of the mountains are exaggerated on this map, but the Mediterranean runs up against a coastal plain. Then there is kind of hill country. Then there's a deep rift valley, and by deep, it's well below sea level. The Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea are both well below sea level. Dead Sea is the lowest point on Earth, minus 1,302 feet here. And then you get some higher mountains and a high plateau for Jordan, back in the day, Moab, all those countries. So you kind of have this coastal plain, hill country, deep deserty rift valley, and then another plateau and some more mountains here. So this influences the geography quite a bit. That coastal plain, you can see on this map, runs basically along the length of Israel. There's a little tiny mountain chain that juts out into the sea, and then there's a little more coastal plain here. There's also a plain that digs in towards that rift valley. Well, guess what? This was an ancient road that would follow this path because of this geography. It was much easier to travel on flat plains than it is to travel through hills or mountains or canyons. And so this coastal road is a lot of the reason, this coastal plain is a lot of the reason for the way things play out in the Bible. The geography does make a huge difference. If you remember, we had this map as well. They talked about two roads. There is a King's Highway that runs along the plateau and actually goes all the way down to the Gulf of Aqaba down here. So it runs kind of this way along this plateau east of the Jordan River. It connects what today is Damascus, the capital of Syria, what today is Amman, the capital of Jordan. These were important cities, important areas back in the day. Petra, you may have seen the ruins of Petra. If you haven't, if you've seen Indiana Jones and the Last Crusade, Petra is on this King's Highway. It's down here in this area. So it's not part of the Holy Land per se. It's the other side of the Jordan River, but it's an important place on this large plateau. So kind of think the Cap Rock here. You've got this large plateau on the far east of what we would call Israel, kind of like our Cap Rock. Then you've got this coastal plain, and here's the the way of the sea, as they called it in our maps, in our book, follows the flat areas down, jumps across through the hills here, and then back onto the coastal plain all the way down to Egypt. So that geography is very important. Yes, somebody's going to ask something.
Tim?
Yeah.
I have a question. Just based on this map, is the Sea of Galilee and the Dead Sea, I think of sea as being salt water, but are these more brackish or fresh water?
Yes and yes. So we'll hold that thought. We'll get to that. That's a good question, Becky. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. So,
Dad,
yes, sir.
one other, just not to go into it, but just out of curiosity, do you know where Jezreel is on the map?
Jezreel. I think Jezreel
Is that over in the coastal plains, or is that?
I'd have to look, Jimmy. I was
Okay, I'll look that up.
But that's a good question.
Okay, sorry.
By the way, Megiddo is here, and Nazareth is just, Megiddo sits down here. Nazareth sits right across the plains of Megiddo from Megiddo. And so, Nazareth would be up here where Jesus grew up, with kind of at the edge of this coastal plain up in the hills. All right, so one of the features of having this way of the sea means that it's attractive to armies to control, to move. There were often times when Israel would be at war with Egypt or with one of the big Mesopotamian empires, Assyria or Babylon or Persia. And there were times when the big boys would be fighting each other. There were times when Egypt was at war with one of the other major empires. Well, if Egypt's at war with Assyria or with Babylon, guess where they're going to go to try to fight? They're going to meet up in Israel. And Israel, we'll see a lot of the history of the Jewish people. There's a lot of geopolitics involved with these big empires. And sometimes they try to take one side, and sometimes they try to take the other side. And there's one period where they make bad choices and get beat up. But just to highlight this, so this plain here often was a battlefield, and there were often battles on the coastal plain as well. But this plain of Megiddo, Egyptian chariots have fought there. Knights in shining armor during the Crusades have fought battles there. British tanks have fought a battle there. So this is a perennial battlefield. In fact, Megiddo is in the book of Revelation. The Jewish word is the hill of Megiddo, Har Megiddo. In the book of Revelation, when you turn that into Greek, Har Megiddo becomes Armageddon. And so the so-called last battle is supposed to take place in the same plain. So it's a perennial battlefield area. Kind of like in Virginia during the Civil War, you'd often fight several battles on the same piece of turf. This was something that happened writ large over thousands of years with all these folks. Okay, so back to the East-West thing. Well, one of the features of East-West, you might think about this as a kind of parallel to the coast of California. You get some similar dynamics. In California, there's an extra mountain range, but you've got moist air that comes in, and it drops rain on the mountains. And the same thing happens in Israel. You get water on this side of the hills and mountains, and you get water up here too. But then there's kind of a rain shadow, just like there is in California. Death Valley in California is on the other side of the Sierras. In fact, think about it. On one side, you have the sequoias, the biggest trees in the world, the biggest creatures in the world. And then on the other side, you've got some of the deepest desert in the world in California. Similar dynamic here. So you can go from green to brown very quickly by crossing these hills. So you go, and we're only talking, remember, 60 miles or so. So in 60 miles, you go from green coastal plains, green hills, brown hills, down to the Dead Sea. So here is a a precipitation map of Israel. And just for comparative purposes, Lubbock is sits in kind of this brownish area. So there are areas of Israel that have rainfall very much like Lubbock. In fact, the Sea of Galilee has some rainfall patterns like Lubbock. But in the same land, and look at the scale down here. This is 50 miles here. So within 100 miles, you've got areas that are as wet as Houston, and you go down here and you've got areas that are drier than Phoenix. And so you've got a very, very full range of climatological zones based on rainfall here. So that makes a huge difference in the way that the story plays out. So just looking west from Jerusalem, Jerusalem kind of sits on top of the hills, basically on the crest. So one direction, you get green hills and coastal plain, and you can see the hint of the Mediterranean out there in the distance, 40 miles away or so, 50 miles away. So Jerusalem kind of sits on that peak. And those coastal plains and hills are green. They're a fertile area. That's where they grow a lot of crops to this day. I showed some of these pictures earlier. But from the same point, looking east into the desert, it turns desert rapidly. So you've got green going this way from Jerusalem and brown going this way down to the Dead Sea. And then you can see the country of Jordan and the plateau, kind of the cap rock we were talking about off in the hazy distance on this shot.
Excuse me, I'm just going to walk through.
Hey, Trey. So this is what east of Jerusalem looks like. When we're talking wilderness, we mean wilderness. I mean, there are occasional tufts of grass. You can see grass, grass. But it would take a lot of square miles to run a sheep, one sheep on this kind of grass. They have to move around a lot in this kind of scrubby desert land. It's very dry. And just how dry is it? This mesa here is Herod's fortress of Masada. He built it, and Herod was always paranoid and wanted places to escape to. So he fortified this entire mesa. 100 years or 75 years after Herod's death, some Jewish rebels took refuge there from the Romans. And the Roman camps, this is not excavation. This is the Roman camp outline still there. It has not eroded away in 1950 years. Still very visible on the desert floor. In fact, the Romans built a siege ramp right up the side of the mesa, the backside, and in 1946 years, that ramp has only eroded this much. There's an automobile, and there are people for scale. So there's not a ton of rain here in the Dead Sea. The erosion has not been significant over the past 1900 years. That's how extremely dry it is. But like driving through New Mexico deserts or Arizona deserts, you do get occasional greenery in wadis, dry riverbeds. If it does rain, things do come into flower pretty quickly. And there are also these little springs and things that give a little extra greenery. This spring here is actually an Israeli national park today. King David hid out here. It's got a perennial 365-day-a-year supply of water. It always stays wet. It's a very beautiful little park. But in context, it's just a little tiny, thin green ribbon at the bottom of this very brown, dry canyon. So it's not a lot of greenery in the Dead Sea Basin. There it is, larger view there. It's just a little tiny ribbon of green. All right, so the east-west, any questions about that before I talk about north-south? And answer Becky's question here. Well, north-south, you've got a different dynamic. You've got the kind of the water cycle that flows north-south. So you've got Mount Hermon, which sits higher than Cloudcroft, New Mexico, higher than Ruidoso, 9,200 feet. And it's snow-capped much of the year. We'll see that in a second. And that flows down. This is the Jordan River. It starts, at the base of Mount Hermon, flows down through a small lake, keeps going down to the Sea of Galilee, which is itself almost 700 feet below sea level. And then that flows down to the Dead Sea. Now, freshwater, dead end. There is no exit from the Dead Sea except evaporation. So it is a brackish salt lake. So you've got wonderful fresh water, Becky, all the way until this point, and then it spills in the Dead Sea, and it's a salt lake, saltier than the Great Salt Lake. I mean, it's a very briny lake. We'll see pictures of all this in a second. But it's wonderful fresh water, and there's agriculture on both sides here because of that. But then it gets brackish, nasty, about as nasty as you can get down at the Dead Sea. So far, so good?
Jim, are there in the Dead Sea, are there bacteria that can live in that highly safe?
I don't know, John. I suspect there probably would be something that would live there, but it's not a fishing place. There are prophecies about one day the Dead Sea will be freshened and God will put fish there. That will be when creation is restored. But right now, it's very, very saline. That's a good question. I don't know about the bacteria. Good question. Just some pictures of this. So remember, we're talking, Mount Hermon. That's kind of the greenest, heaviest, wettest area up here, and then it flows down the Jordan and through some drier and drier areas down to the Dead Sea, which is very, very dry indeed. And in fact, the Dead Sea is shrinking because of the agriculture. The amount of water from the Jordan going into it these days is not keeping up with evaporation. There have been some talk, Jordan and Israel are talking about importing water down because it's 1,300 feet below sea level, filling the Dead Sea and keeping it level with seawater, which would actually freshen it up because it's much more saline than seawater, and putting hydroelectric stuff on the way down. So there's talk about that, replenishing the Dead Sea and getting some electricity from the Gulf of Aqaba down this way, but we'll see. Also,
Jim,
yes, John.
do they mine the salt in the Dead Sea?
They do, yeah. Well, I'll show you a picture here. It's actually it's not so much for salt, but it's for beauty products. That's the biggest export from it. But there are some other minerals too.
And we've bought some. I bought some of that stuff.
Yeah, Dead Sea salts are very. I brought you some back from Israel, but you can get them at the South Plains Mall. You used to have a kiosk out there at the South Plains Mall for that stuff. So Mount Hermon, beautiful mountain, snow-capped much of the year. Heavy rainfall, heavy snowfall. That's the water source for this entire hydrological cycle. And when you're up at the north end here, it looks beautiful. It's green, it's mossy. You might think you're in New England or something. It really is beautiful up at this end of things. I mean, look at that on those rocks there. That's up near actually Caesarea Philippi, where Jesus asked, "Who do you say that I am?" But that's another thing. The Jordan, as it descends, there's some rapids up in that northern part of the Jordan River. Then you hit the Sea of Galilee, freshwater lake, small freshwater lake relatively. Sea of Galilee, Lake Tiberias, Lake Gennesaret, all the same body of water, different names. And we see it on a scripture map and think, oh, this must be a gigantic lake. It's the Sea of Galilee. Well, remember, sea is a Jewish word. The Jews didn't have a big vocabulary, and anything bigger than a puddle was a sea. So the Sea of Galilee is really a lake, a freshwater lake. It's not a Great Lake. There it is in the midst of the smallest of the Great Lakes, Lake Ontario, and it's teeny tiny. We're not talking a gigantic body of water here at all. About 7 miles by about 13 miles. There it is compared to Lubbock's Loop. And in fact, if you rotate the Sea of Galilee and superimpose it, it just about is the same size as Lubbock's Loop, give or take. Really, really close in size. So that gives you a sense of how big that lake is. Not gigantic, yet it is freshwater. It is teeming with fish and has been for a long while. Fishing is still an industry there, as it was in Jesus' time. And as it was in David's time. This is a great place for fishing. All right, then the Jordan flows south. It's not quite as rapid-like. It's a slower flow down. It goes through some, they pump some out for agricultural stuff on both sides of the Jordan. And as you get closer to the Dead Sea, it gets more deserty, and the ribbon of green gets thinner and thinner until it spills into this salt lake. And the Dead Sea is salt lake, very saline. they're just crystals, just salt crystals, just coat the rocks on the seashore, the lake shore there. Again, the Dead Sea is not a sea in the way it's a salt lake. And it really, it's more salt crystals. It really, the biggest industry at the Dead Sea now is tourism. The Germans and Northern Europeans love to go down there. It's a great place. It stays warm because it's so low. You see how high they can float in it. Like Renee said, the Dead Sea mud. That's a Caucasian guy that's coated in the black mineral mud. There are spas all over the place on the Dead Sea that you go and get mud treatments. And they do harvest some, say there's some evaporation pools and things. And they do evaporate some salt and things like that from it, get some minerals out as well. But not much use for anything else. Not a living lake. So any questions about that north-south piece?
Jim, yeah, could you, I'm never sure about the northern and the southern kingdoms of Israel. How do they correspond to this north-south?
Okay, well, we will spend quite a bit of that time, but the southern kingdom is the kingdom of Judah, which on these maps is kind of down this area, Judah and Benjamin, two of the tribes. And then Israel is kind of this area here, the northern kingdom is kind of this area here. So King David had from Dan to Beersheba, and he and Solomon had the maximum territory, and influence went all the way up to Damascus and across the Jordan. But this was their area here. After the Civil War, after Solomon's time, this is Judah. This is the southern kingdom, Judah or Judea, the Roman name for it. This is the kingdom of Israel up here that Assyria wipes out. So we had this chart. This is kind of just a 10,000-foot overview of history here. It shows Egypt. It shows Canaan, which is Israel. It's the Levant. It shows Syria, which is their neighbor to the northeast, and it shows the rest of Mesopotamia and what is happening there. We'll go through a lot of these pieces of history, especially kind of this area. Abraham comes somewhere in this range here. The Exodus happens somewhere in this range.
I missed that. Could you say it again, please?
I don't know why Siri thinks I just talked to her, but okay. So the Exodus is somewhere in here, and Egypt is a going concern all the way through Cleopatra, and it's still an important place even during the Roman Empire. Mesopotamia, on the other hand, you've got Abraham coming from that area. We'll see that later on. You've got the Hittites who are up in the north, kind of in the Turkey, what we would call Turkey area. Assyria rises after the Hittites. Babylon rises after that. Persia rises after that. And each time, Babylon bumps off Assyria, Persia bumps off Babylon. Alexander the Great comes in, the Hellenistic period, and bumps off Persia. And then the Romans come in eventually. There's a little window here of about almost 100 years where the Jews have some independence at the end of the Hellenistic period and before the Roman period. So really Jewish independence as a real functioning nation really is only about 400 years here and another 100 years here, give or take, and then 1945 and forward after that. So, those 400 years is nothing to sneeze at. That's a long period, but a lot of the Bible times they are under foreign domination. The Babylonians, the Assyrians in the north, the Persians, the Greeks, and not when I say, well, Hellenism and is a Greek offshoot, but there is a slight difference. I mean, Alexander the Great came from Macedonia. Anyway, that's another thing. But they spoke Greek. They were ethnically Greek, more or less. so you've got this succession of empires that will influence them. So you have a period of independence. You had them in Egypt, and you had Abraham as just kind of a nomadic family that's not going to leave much of a geopolitical footprint on the map. And so, the Jewish history in the Holy Land is not one where they dominated. They didn't show up there in the year 2000 BC and dominate until 2000 AD. In those 4,000 years, they were absent for part of the time. They were absent for much of the time, many of the Jews, after 70 and until 1945, or at least until the early 1900s, late 1800s. So the Jewish people are a small people, and yet their importance in world history is far outstripped compared to their size because of their religious influence here. Most other nations of that size. How many Hittites have you met? How many Assyrians have you met? There are some Syrians still in the land of where Assyria used to be, but these are not going concerns so much. Egypt is still around. Persia is now Iran. Babylon's now Iraq. But for whatever reason, the Jewish people have survived. And I would say there's something intrinsic in that, tied up in their religious history that helps that out. But they're kind of a unique culture because of that. Okay, that was a very quick walk through the Tanakh, the books of the Old Testament, and some geography and some very brief history. We'll dig a lot more into the history as we go through all of this. Any questions at this point?
No questions, but boy, this is great. I love the maps and the color and the different types of maps, and I like the photographs. I feel like I'm there.
Well, good. And we won't have as many maps and things. I'm not going to do a PowerPoint every week, but especially when we're talking about geography and all of that, I think it's much more helpful to have the color and the pictures. Other questions at this point? I'm going to stop the sharing. Go back to this. All right, y'all. Well, very good. Well, next week we'll spend just a little bit of time on JEP&D, which I think Regina was asking about, but she's now here, practicing. I can hear her practicing with Fiona. So we'll do that, and then we'll look at the first creation story, the Genesis 1 creation story. And then the next week we'll look at the Genesis 2 and 3 creation story, 2 different creation stories, 2 different sources most likely. We'll talk about all that next week. So any final thoughts or questions?
Jim, thank you. That was a wonderful introduction to this.
Yeah.
Thank you very much.
Well, thank you all.
Great to be back.
Yeah, very good, Jim. Thank you.
Very good. Good to see you all, and we'll see you later.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.